So I asked 367 fantasy readers, what is the worst way to start a fantasy novel? I'm about to share the 10 most common responses, along with giving my thoughts on how you can avoid making these mistakes in your own writing based on my own experience as a fantasy author, so that you can use this data to write better openings. We had over 23,000 words of responses for this survey, so as we go through these 10 things, you'll learn which of them I personally dislike the most, along with a couple of instances where I actually disagree with the survey answers. So let's start with number 10, meeting too many characters at once. To quote from the survey here, readers hate when you introduce too many characters in the first chapter. If it's in the format of a visual novel, it's a bit better if done right, but for a written book, throwing out 20 plus characters in a row, conversing with each other, is just confusing. Another response here. I hate when there's too many characters introduced at once or constantly switching point of view characters. I like having time to get to know a character before the point of view changes. And then the last one here, too many names. So I totally agree with this here. You want to give readers a smooth entry point into your story, and throwing a bunch of names at them can make it very difficult and create a lot of friction for them as they're getting into your fantasy novel. Even with something like Harry Potter, which has 772 named characters over the course of the series, the first chapter only names 14 characters. Now, even 14, that number can sound kind of big when you're thinking about it, but it works and flows really nicely because the characters are introduced gradually over the course of the chapter. And there's also very clear relationships mapped out between all the different characters. It also helps as well that the story describes these characters in very distinctive, unique ways that makes them instantly memorable from the first page. For example, Professor McGonagall transforms from a cat into a human, and Rubeus Hagrid is a giant of a man who arrives on this huge motorcycle. Look critically at the opening in your fantasy novel and ask yourself, am I overwhelming readers with too many characters here? Or can I pare things back and start in a more simple fashion? The next worst way to start your fantasy novel, according to my survey here, is with meaningless action scenes. So one reader said that they really dislike a battle scene with throwaway characters I don't know and have no reason to be interested in. Usually this is done as a sort of prologue and it's not really that important to the main story. Another response said, high tension moments. I don't really have a reason to care yet. Killing a character right at the beginning usually bores me. You gotta give them meaning before I'm gonna care about them dying. And then the last one said, opening with too many characters in the midst of a confusing conflict without providing a reason why we'd care. I totally agree that bad action scenes are a massive turnoff for myself and for many other readers out there, because it's boring to just read about the bare mechanics of armies clashing or people fighting when you have no real emotional investment in it. But there actually is a way to start with action that immediately hooks readers, defines your characters, and kicks off the events of your plot. And I know this because it's a technique that I worked really hard to do in some of my own novels, such as The Thunder Heist, which has left readers leaving reviews like this. This book is go, go, go from page 1, which kept me riveted and excited. Thanks, Sam, for that great review. And then right from the beginning, it is high-paced and engaging from start to finish, says Matt. So what is the difference between writing boring action and meaningful action in chapter 1 of your fantasy novel? Well, boring action thinks that just the action itself is enough to interest readers, whereas meaningful action realizes that the action is interesting to the extent that it reveals, challenges, and develops character. And this is why I often say this to the clients I work with. You have to be really careful about learning from movies when it comes to writing a fantasy novel, because in a movie, the pure visuals and the kineticness and the sound effects of an action sequence, that can be enough to grip you and entertain you as an audience member without actually caring too much about the inner emotional lives of the characters on the screen. However, in a book, you do not have that immediate access to visuals and sound in the same way that a movie does. So if you're just going to write a scene where your fantasy character is chasing someone across the rooftops of a medieval city, and you're just relying on the mechanics of that chase to be exciting, it's probably going to fall a little bit flat in your book. But if you can make us understand why this chase is happening, what it means, why it's important for your character to catch this other character, and what's at stake, then we will be far more invested in that as an opening scene. So if you're wanting to start your fantasy novel with action, you should be asking yourself the following 3 questions. The first one is, how does this action show the personality, flaws, and character traits of my characters involved? For example, in the first chapter of my pirate fantasy novel, The Thunder Heist, we start with Kef being on this prison ship and she is about to be executed. As she's brought up to be executed, the judge reads off this huge list of various nautical crimes she has committed over the past few years. And Kef goes, not bad, you got about half of them. And so immediately we get this sense of Kef being this very competent, cocky master pirate with a very reckless and sort of roguish streak about her. Question number 2, how does this action build connection to my characters? So again, in the Thunder Heist, Kef is immediately positioned as an underdog. She's about to be executed. And so there is a natural sort of sympathy that the reader has for her in that situation. And then the third question is, how can this action kick off the plot? You don't always need this. Sometimes, like in Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, one of my favorite openings ever, you can just have a self-contained action sequence that defines characters and tells you a little bit about the world, but doesn't necessarily have huge relevance to the plot that's coming ahead. But if you can figure out a way to link the opening action in your story to the wider events of your book as a whole, it's probably going to make a more resonant story. So for example, in the Thunder Heist, we learned that Kef allowed herself to be captured and taken on board this prison ship for execution so that she could free another prisoner. And that ties into the wider events of the story as we kind of flow out from there. So the next worst way to start your fantasy novel, according to my survey, is with prologues, especially historical ones. Now, this is a bit of an interesting one. Prologues can be a certainly divisive topic within the fantasy writing space. So one reader said that it's bad to start with a prologue that happens years, decades, or sometime long ago before the story begins. Sometimes it even takes place in a land far away. Who cares about characters or places that are not in the main story? Another response said, I don't like prologues that show something completely different to the main storyline with no relevance to it, or whose relevance only becomes apparent towards the end of the book, or even in the next book in the series, lol. And then another respondent said, many of the books I love have prologues, and sometimes they are great, but honestly, I am sick of them. I am bored of them. Start the story at the start. Let's get on with it. Another reader said, I hate a detached prologue. I love a good prologue, and I understand that is almost the exact point of a prologue. However, I have read many books where it felt so tonally removed from what followed, or the characters or point never came back, that it was almost a distraction while I tried to read, especially the first chapter. And then another respondent said, I hate obscure prologues from the point of view a character who dies right away, never appears again, or has no real connection to the story. Don't get me invested in someone who won't matter for the rest of the novel. So I actually wrote a blog post way back in 2016 titled Why Prologues Are Pointless, where I expressed my unbridled hate for prologues. And if you asked me at the time how you should go about writing a prologue, I would have said, don't. But I've somewhat changed my mind since then. I still think that in 95% of cases, it is a bad decision to start your story with a prologue, purely because they tend to be so overdone and they have massive connotations in readers' minds of being a way to info dump or to just explain a bunch of history that has no real relevance to your story. And so you're sort of fighting an uphill battle as a writer when readers see the word prologue. And you'll actually notice that some authors are sneaky about this. They will write a prologue, but they'll just call it chapter 1. So again, the start of Harry Potter is a prologue. It takes place when Harry is a little baby, but it's called chapter 1. And it makes the story feel so much more immediate just because of that tiny little change. So that can be something to think about as well. It is also worthwhile noting that a prologue can give you a unique advantage as a writer that you can't get access to if you just start with chapter 1. For example, they can give you a hook which could otherwise be impossible to convey. In A Game of Thrones, for example, the prologue introduces these supernatural monsters beyond the wall in the frozen north. Then chapter 1 hooks us with much more interpersonal political conflict instead. This sets up a looming threat that hangs over the story and also immediately establishes that there is some kind of magic and supernatural forces in this world, and that would not be immediately apparent for several hundreds of more pages if not for that prologue. So having that prologue there kind of immediately establishes some key details about the world, which might otherwise feel jarring if the author waited until later to introduce those things. Another cool thing about prologues, which rarely gets discussed, is that they can give you license to try really cool and creative openings that almost serve as this really evocative mood setter for the story to come. So take this 2-sentence prologue from Never Die by Rob J. Hayes. Etami Cho woke to the screams of her own death. She remembered it all. That's it. That is the full extent of the prologue in this story. And I think it does a really good job of just instantly hooking the reader. So the rule of thumb for you to remember here is that prologues are going to fail if you are just using it and relying on it to lazily dump exposition or a bunch of details about your world to your reader. However, prologues can work really well if you are using it to set the tone, establish some key conflicts, and foreshadow where the plot of your novel might be headed. I've certainly worked with a lot of writers to help them refine their prologues. Over the last 2 years or so, I've personally coached over 80 writers through my fantasy outlining bootcamp, my one-on-one story coaching program, and my live workshops, and quite a few of these authors actually have decided to start their stories with a prologue, and it can be a totally valid decision in many of their cases. What I always find with their prologues, though, is that trying to make them as short as possible so that they don't overstay their welcome, in every single instance where we've done that, it has massively improved the quality of their story. So that is something to keep in mind when you're writing a prologue. Keep things as concise as possible. And then the next worst way to start your fantasy novel, according to my reader survey, is with dream sequences. So one reader said, I really don't like stories that start with a dream sequence, especially if it's not made instantly clear that it's a dream from the first line. Another respondent said, dream sequences are such a cop-out that they frustrate me. I used to do them, but if you must have a dream sequence, make it mean something. Another respondent said, during a dream, daydream, or other not really happening thing, only for the protagonist to wake up and it never happened. People tend to hate opening up to dreams. I don't mind if you make it clear from the beginning. Still, I hate whenever the author makes things as confusing as possible. So again, I have edited dozens of first chapters from the various fantasy writers I have worked with, and I've read hundreds more from the people who have applied to work with me, because usually you have to submit your first chapter so that I can see if you're a good fit or not. And there is not one single instance where I have read a dream sequence and walked away thinking, oh, I'm really glad that dream sequence was there. I know that sounds kind of harsh, but that is just the truth, especially when you're in the position like I am, where you're just seeing so many first chapters. Dream sequences begin to feel really, really cliched and really, really overdone. Now, of course, there are a few dream sequences out there, and maybe you can think of some in the stories you love that are tolerable. And I have certainly read some dream sequences that are borderline tolerable to me. But at this point, just opening your story with a dream, especially your fantasy novel, is just overdone to the point where you have to be doing something truly exceptional in order to justify this. Because again, there is this big uphill battle that you're fighting against all the other bad dream openings that are out there. A rare exception, I would say, is if the notion of dreams is centrally important to your story, like Inception, for example, that is a story all about dreams. It kind of makes sense that it opens with a dream. But the really big issue with the dream sequence is that you get readers invested in a particular scene, a particular conflict. You build up stakes, you build up tension, and then you wipe it all away when readers realize, oh, that was for nothing. That was pointless. And you've wasted their time. And when readers are so willing to stop reading your story in those first few opening pages, when you're trying to do that critical job of capturing their attention and making them want to spend 300, 400, 500, 1,000 pages with your characters and with your plot, why would you waste their time with something as cheap as a dream sequence? Now, of course, there are ways to do this well. As with all of these worst things I'm going through this video, there are, of course, exceptions to every single rule here. But I just find there is such a high degree of difficulty with this particular opening format of starting with a dream. Now, the next worst way to start your fantasy novel is overusing too many made-up terms and fantasy names. So one respondent said, it's really annoying when I read long sentences or sentences with a lot of fantasy terms. It can feel overwhelming if you have no grasp of what's happening in the first few pages due to fantasy jargon. Another respondent said, the absolute worst way to start a fantasy novel, this response kind of cracked me up a bit, is to tell me someone wrote a Jarali in the deep woods and someone else wrote a Tami or an Ahutua after it, even though they were meant to go fetch some piney coney milk from the piney coners that live in the trees of the fog falls in the north. Kind of a spurious example. This respondent actually probably wrote another paragraph of just a bunch of made up words like this, which I really appreciated. I thought if it was you, like, well done, this was funny. But in terms of my thoughts on this particular mistake of overusing all these different made up terms and jargons, it is very execution dependent. I can think of a lot of good examples where they do use a ton of made up terms, but it all flows well because we understand the broad context behind what everything it means and what everything is doing, even if we don't understand the unique meanings of every single word in isolation. And so as long as everything kind of feels clear and it's flowing in your story, it's probably going to be okay. Still, like I said earlier in this video, you want to give readers a smooth entry point into your story. And when you throw a bunch of fantasy names and made up jargon at them, that is something that increases the friction and increases the reader's resistance when it comes to them sinking into your fantasy world. And I find in particular with this mistake, this is something that's very easy to make if you have been working on your fantasy novel for 5 years, for 10 years, and you maybe understand what all these different terms mean, but for someone who's just coming fresh into your story, they don't have that same understanding that you do. This is why it's so important to get feedback on your writing, and particularly feedback on your first chapter, so that you can know if it's actually resonating with readers in the way that you want. Now, in a moment, we'll move on to the 5th worst way to start your fantasy novel, but if you're wanting to write a better first chapter in your fantasy novel, then you should check out my first chapter mastery course. This shares everything I've learned from writing the opening chapters in my own 4 published fantasy novels and from editing tons and tons of first chapters for my clients. You'll learn how to write perfect character introductions, set up your world building, and hook readers so that it is impossible for them to put your story down. Plus, you will see real before and after examples of how I've edited opening chapters for other fantasy writers. There's even the option to get my personal feedback on your writing, although full disclosure, there are limited slots for this because I only have so much time to give feedback, and this option may disappear at some point in the future. So if it is important for you to get my personal feedback, then you should probably check out the course today. Now, First Chapter Mastery initially began as a live workshop that I ran with 46 fantasy writers, and I have since improved and refined the things I taught in that workshop, and the full recording of that is also available inside the course itself. Here's what one of the students from that workshop said.
I just took Jed's first chapter critique workshop, and it was an absolutely amazing experience. This workshop was the single most validating experience I've had in my 10 years of writing, and I have never been more motivated to continue writing and finish my story.
You can get this course by going to firstchaptermastery.com or by using the link in the description down below. And now let's move on to the 5th worst way to start your fantasy novel, which is with characters waking up and doing their everyday, mundane, daily routines. To quote from the survey here, there is nothing more boring than starting with a character waking up, getting out of bed, getting dressed, and going about normal, boring, routine tasks. Another respondent said, I hate weather descriptions or the main character doing everyday stuff, anything ordinary. Another respondent said, starting off with something normal is the worst way to start a fantasy novel. If the main character is just going about their average day with nothing disturbing them, there isn't much to get a reader going and invested into the story. Another reader said, a boring situation where the character isn't doing much, too much description of the surroundings and not of the character. So I totally agree with this. Out of everything on the list, this is the thing I dislike the most. It's my biggest pet peeve to read when I'm going into a fantasy novel. However, there is one big exception. If your character's everyday, normal, mundane routine is actually interesting, then you can show that normal mundane routine. For example, if your main character is a dragon rider and her morning everyday routine involves her waking up in some cliffside cave where she was sleeping with her dragon, repairing her dragon's saddle, checking out the weather to see what route they can fly that day, and then setting out onto one of their regular patrols they do over the countryside, for her, that is just a normal, average Tuesday. But for us as readers, it feels exciting, it feels interesting, it feels different, and it feels unique because it is outside of the sort of typical normal things we associate with regular daily routines. So if a routine is normal for characters but interesting and unique for readers, then it is okay to show a regular routine. But in most cases here, I totally agree with these survey answers. Mundane daily routines are generally boring. Instead, you want to show us the day when everything changes. Start with the event that disrupts your character's ordinary world and propels her into the extraordinary world of your story. When you do that, you give readers an instant sense of momentum and you create this implicit promise that everything is changing, something different is happening, therefore this is going to be worth your time. The next worst way to start your fantasy novel is with confusing or disorienting openings. One respondent said, I hate being dropped in the middle of a scene but having absolutely no idea what is going on. Another reader said, direct complex conflict with stakes I know nothing about or requiring knowledge that is presented after the fact, even if it is immediately after the fact. Another reader said, I really dislike when the author abruptly throws you into a scene or story thread with little context or what I call wind-up. when I can't get my bearings in the world and story, any further developments that the author presents on the page are meaningless and inherently uninteresting. So when I ran that first chapter critique workshop, which again, you get the full recording of that inside the first chapter mastery program, I had 46 writers on the call, and this was one of the biggest pieces of advice that I gave to all of them, because I read all of their opening chapters when they submitted it, when they signed up for the workshop. And one of the biggest things I said to them was that you want to be writing an instantly comprehensible scenario in the first chapter of your novel. What I mean by that is that I tend to read a lot of opening chapters where we have no idea where the characters are until page 5, or sometimes not at all. And it just feels like the characters are just floating in space and there's no real grounding of where they are. While that can sometimes work, as a general rule of thumb, you want readers to know the following 3 points of information in the first 1 to 3 chapters. The first thing is, who is the point of view character? Whose head are we actually in? The second thing is, where is this set? Are the characters in a forest? Are they in a castle? Are they in some floating airship? Where is this actually set? You don't need to go overboard with describing things. Oftentimes you just need to say a one-word concept so that readers immediately have some understanding of going, oh, okay, cool, we're in these dark caverns, or oh, we're in this volcano, got it. And then the third thing is, what is actually happening? What are the characters trying to do? What's going on around them? Consider this opening from Mistborn: The Final Empire. Ash fell from the sky. Lord Tresting frowned, glancing up at the ruddy midday sky as his servants scuttled forward, opening a parasol over Tresting and his distinguished guest. Ashfalls weren't that uncommon in the Final Empire, but Tresting had hoped to avoid getting soot stains on his fine new suit coat and red vest, which had just arrived via canal boat from Luthadel itself. Fortunately, there wasn't much wind. The parasol would likely be effective. Tresting stood with his guest on a small hilltop patio that overlooked the fields. Hundreds of people in brown smocks worked in the falling ash, caring for the crops. There was a sluggishness to their efforts, but of course, that was the way of the Scar. That right there is a clear, instantly comprehensible scenario. We understand immediately that we are in a world of ash and smog, and that we are in the perspective of this sort of rich, noble figure who owns a farm or some kind of plantation with servants or slaves that are all working grudgingly for him. The next worst way to start your fantasy novel is to begin with irrelevant characters or scenes. One reader said, I absolutely hate when novels start the prologue or first chapter with a throwaway character. Another reader said, starting with anything but the main character except in certain rare circumstances. Another reader said, opening with a setup that is either broadly irrelevant and / or will never get a payoff, although there is maybe some leeway for prologues. Interesting response. Another reader said, starting with side characters is misleading, and I can think of very few times where it would be good. And then another respondent said, I dislike when we start with what looks to be the main character, but they die in the second chapter and are never mentioned or referred to again. Generally speaking, I do agree that 95% of the time, you should just start in your main character's perspective. Readers are like baby ducks. The first face they see, they're just going to imprint themselves onto that and think, that's my mummy or that's my daddy. And readers, when they first meet a character in your story, they're just going to assume that's the main character because it's the first name that I met. Okay, I'm assuming this is the person the story is all about. Of course, if you do something like you kill them off or you make it very, very clear they're just a side character, that is something where you can sometimes get away with this. But still, it can be a very frustrating experience for your reader where you get them attached to a certain person or they think that this person is who the story is about, and then you wrench them away from it. It can make readers feel like they have been lied to. Oftentimes when people do this, it's because you are afraid that it will be boring if you start with your main character. Nuh-uh. That is a sign right there that you need to make your main character more interesting, or you need to start in a moment where you can show your main character having a very characteristic or distinctive choice where they decide to do something that 99% of other characters wouldn't do in that situation. Now all of a sudden you've got a much more interesting opening for them. However, one notable exception to this mistake of starting with side characters is what I call the hype man opening. So this is where you are intentionally starting in a side character's perspective and you are using them to build up some important details about the main character, so that when you meet the main character later, their introduction feels more impactful because of how we've already built them up in our mind, previous to jumping into their perspective. So the second worst way to start your fantasy novel is with a slow or boring start. One reader said, a drawn-out start is probably the easiest killer of any work of fiction, regardless of genre. I hate it when we find ourselves just reading for pages on end without pretty much anything to hold our interest. Another reader said, I hate it when the novel starts with a long, tedious biography of the main character, who they are and their entire backstory and goals and magical abilities and what makes them special, without much connection to the actual plot. And then another respondent said, if it's too slow, this can vary depending on the genre and theme, so it's hard to give a rule of thumb here. The best example of this is The Lord of the Rings. I love the story, but damn, it takes so long to get started. So readers fundamentally want to feel a sense of progress and reward for reading your novel, especially in the opening few pages. What readers are really looking for in the first chapter of your fantasy novel is, can I trust this author to take me on a satisfying journey and a satisfying reading experience? And one of the big things that readers will look for to subconsciously develop that trust is, can this author take me through a satisfyingly structured scene or several scenes in this first chapter? That is, can you present the reader with an interesting hook? Can this lead to showing the reader your character's goal for this particular scene? Can you then show us the conflict that stands before the character achieving this goal and provides resistance and difficulty? And then can you lead us to a satisfying climax that resolves this conflict and then leads into the next hook and goal and so forth as the story continues? I cover scene structure in a lot more detail inside First Chapter Mastery, so again, the link is down below if you want to check that out. The main thing for you to remember is that as long as you can take readers through a well-structured and satisfying scene in your first chapter, giving them that sense of progress, giving them the sense that by the end of the first chapter, something has meaningfully changed or progressed. When you can do that, readers are going to have confidence in your abilities to tell a much bigger arc of a story over the course of your whole novel. Now, taking this further, I personally like my first few chapters to actually end on cliffhangers so that readers really have that sense of propulsion through those first couple of chapters, and so that they feel compelled to keep reading. For example, with Across the Broken Stars, there are cliffhangers at the end of chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it's only when you get to the end of chapter 5 that you have a moment of respite, an opportunity to relax as a reader before the story continues on. By that stage, hopefully the use of cliffhangers and plotting has dragged the reader through the story to the point where they're now attached to the characters and they're invested in the plot and they're interested to know more about the world building. And that gives you a little bit of breathing room as a writer to then ease the throttle back on the pace, let the story breathe a little bit more, and move them forward with the story. Okay, so we're about to get into the absolute worst way to start your fantasy novel based on this survey I ran here. Next week, I'm going to be doing a video where I look at the top 10 best ways to start your fantasy novel, again, based on the exact same survey where I asked both of these questions. So make sure you are subscribed to the channel and you have your notifications turned on so that you don't miss that follow-up video. And the worst way to start your fantasy novel, according to this big reader survey, is with info dumping and excessive world-building exposition. One reader said, I hate it when the writer drags the beginning of the story by bogging it down, info dumping. Whether it's about the world or the character's backstory, if it isn't needed to drive the plot or the character development forward, then the reader doesn't need to know. Another reader said, with slow, clunky world building that doesn't add to the plot and could instead be integrated into the story in a more creative way through character interaction or travel. Another reader said, I hate when a book starts with pages and pages of lore or with a history of the world. I'd much rather find out the relevant things while the story is actually going on, rather than reading something which may or may not be relevant. So personally, I think it's only an info dump if readers don't care about it. But if you can make your info dump unique or interesting enough, whether through distinctive details they've never read anywhere else, or through some distinctive original sense of voice or tone, then readers are going to eat it up. For example, in The Color of Magic, which is Terry Pratchett's very first Discworld novel, it begins by describing how this flat fantasy world rests on the backs of 4 elephants, which themselves stand on a giant turtle which is slowly flying through space. Apart from the turtles and the elephants and the mechanics around how that works, we don't meet any other major characters in this opening. We don't even really get a suggestion of what the main plot of this story is all about. We just get this hilarious world building that sets up the kind of absurdist Monty Python style comedy of the Discworld series. Still, when it comes to your own writing and when it comes to starting your own fantasy novel, most of the time you are better off staying small and focused with your world building in the first chapter. Introduce 1 or 2 characters, Give readers one or two interesting aspects of your world, dangle maybe one or two irresistible narrative hooks about the plot of your story, and then you can expand later on from there. Info dumping is one of the most common world-building mistakes that new writers fall victim to. If you want to avoid these 6 biggest world-building mistakes I see new fantasy writers make all the time, then check out this video over here. Keep writing and keep striving.